I've spent weeks bringing this wrecked Toyota Hilux back to life. After a full chassis swap, fixing the front end, and respraying the body, it's completely transformed. But now, it's time for the real test. Will it actually start? Will it actually move? One thing's for sure, this is going to be an interesting video. The damage was all on the left side. The fender wall smashed, control arms twisted, but the biggest problem, the chassis leg. It was completely bent. Now we did try an attempt to repair it, and yes, we managed to get it straight, but we wanted to push ourselves and make this 100%. We decided to go all in and replace the entire chassis. It was a massive job, but it had to get done. After giving the chassis a fresh coat of paint to protect it from corrosion, we got stuck into our next job. First, we removed the bin from the Hilux and set it aside. This was clearing out the way to remove the prop shaft, the fuel tank, and the differential. It was just about undoing bolts and disconnecting the electrics. Out. 4 bolts I'm taking out there. There, that too. Fuel tank cover. Fuel lines. And just like that, the prop shaft and fuel tank were out. Next up, we tackled the differential. To get the differential out, we had to remove the shackles that were holding the leaf springs to the chassis. But once the diff was free, we secured the two wheels back onto the wheel hubs to make it easier to move around. With everything prepped, it was finally ready to send the diff for painting. Another step closer in bringing this Hilux back to life. We got underneath to tackle the front prop shaft. A few bolts later, it was out, and we were ready to move on to the big one, pulling the engine. Now, pulling an engine isn't about just yanking it out. First, we had to disconnect the ECU and push the wiring loom through the dashboard. We also had to remove the power steering reservoir, as well as connections to the battery and the fuse box. We managed to wiggle out the engine and gearbox out of the Hilux. Honestly, it felt like it was fighting us the whole way. One of those jobs where you think it'll take 10 minutes, and an hour later, you are just still at it. While inspecting the engine and gearbox, I noticed that the sump was damaged. This was going to be my first time doing a gearbox service. I cracked all of the bolts holding the sump onto the gearbox and loosened them right out. And you can see that bracket is broken. I removed the damaged oil filter and replaced it with a new one. I managed to wipe the excess residue on the mating surface for the sump to clamp on. Once that was fixed, we could now mount the engine and gearbox to the new freshly painted chassis. All the parts that went for painting had arrived. The rear differential was first. Now that was done, we could assemble the right and left rear shocks. Once that was done, I managed to put on the handbrake cable and mount the rear cross member on. I started by removing the split pin from the castle nut. Once that was out, I moved on to the 10mm bolt holding the ABS sensor in place. I removed the drive shaft cover and unbolted the CV nut. I used a 10mm wrench to disconnect the brake line and undid the two bolts holding the caliper in place, as well as the brake disc. I marked the camber adjustment bolts to ensure I'd have decent wheel alignment upon installing the wheels. Camber adjustment bolts are what help set the angle of the wheels to tilt inwards or tilt outwards. The exact same process was repeated on the left-hand side where the damage had occurred. However, on this side, the stub axle was bent due to the impact of the crash. I removed the 4 bolts holding the wheel bearing onto the bent stub axle and moved it over to the new one. I made sure to refit the O-ring, the brake shield, and the CV joint flange. Next, I moved on to removing the sway bar and the steering rack assembly. Before disconnecting the steering, I marked the center point on the steering column to ensure that the steering wheel would remain straight during reassembly and to prevent damage to the clock spring. Next up was removing the 3 bolts holding the front differential assembly. From there, the next step was to remove the wiring harness, which was attached to the cabin. I carefully unclipped it from the chassis. After that, I moved on to disconnecting the brake lines and the exhaust. I started by removing the brake lines and their brackets, ensuring everything was detached properly. After that, I removed the exhaust hanger bushings, which holds the exhaust in place. With the exhaust free, I installed it onto the new chassis and secured it by tightening the spring-loaded exhaust bolts. The new plan? We are turning this Hilux into a Legend 50. For those of you who don't know, the Legend 50 is a limited edition model celebrating 50 years of the Hilux brand. From there, it was time to drop in the fuel tank and install the front differential. Now, fitting the front differential wasn't just a simple slide in. It required lifting the transmission slightly to create enough clearance. Once everything lined up perfectly, we secured it by tightening the 3 mounting bolts back into place. Next, we moved on to securing the front prop shaft and reinstalling the steering rack assembly. This also included fitting the sway bar back into place. Essentially, it was the reverse of what we did earlier. Piece by piece, everything was coming back together smoothly. Now it was time to start and reinstall the front suspension. We started on the right-hand side shock, securing it in place. We then attached the wheel hub assembly and bolted down the CV nut. We repeated the exact same process on the left-hand side, starting with the upper control arm, lower control arm, the shock, wheel hub assembly, and the brake disc. We gave the calipers a fresh look with a coat of red paint, making them pop against the build. Then we installed them by simply doing the reverse of the steps that we did earlier. To finish it off, we mounted the brand new wheels, the Legend 50 rims, onto the front suspension. Next, we decided to tackle the prop shaft center bearing. We had removed the universal joint by using a socket and a hammer to remove the U-joint bearing. After this, we had access to the carrier bearing. Finally, the Hilux is back on all 4 wheels and it's looking better than ever. We started by removing the 6 bolts securing the chassis to the cabin. We moved it out of the way to prep for rolling the new chassis underneath. We did not have a 4-post lift, so mounting the cabin onto the chassis was a challenge. But we did get creative, using an engine hoist, tires, an oil drum, and old light poles. Once it was at the right height, we rolled the new chassis underneath. From there, we used a bottle jack to lower it down, making sure all mounting points lined up perfectly. Afterwards, we secured the 6 mounting bolts in place. The front left side of the cradle was damaged, and the left fender valve was pushed back into the cabin. To replace them, we drilled out the spot welds and removed the both parts. After that, we took out the fuse box and its bracket. With everything stripped down, we were ready to start rebuilding the front end. With the cradle and left fender valve pre-painted, we moved on to mock assembly. We fitted the cradle, the fender wall, and the fenders. Then test fitted the headlights, grille, bonnet, and bumper to check the alignment. Everything lined up perfectly. So we stripped it back down and started tacking the panels in place with spot welds. Cradle is on, bonnet is on, bonnet hinge is damaged, left fender wall is damaged. These brackets I had to keep, but this one was still intact. This is new. Once secured, I belt sanded the welds flat, getting the front end ready for paint. Before painting the front end, we added 30mm spacers to align the body and the wheels for a cleaner, more aggressive look. To get the alignment close, I did a manual wheel alignment using a string, making sure it touched both wheels evenly. Our next task was removing all 4 doors to prepare for paint. First, we stripped the door cards, unplugged the wiring harness, and removed the locking mechanism. After that, we took out the door handle mechanism, window beadings, windows, and window regulator. Back at the front end, we masked the joints where seam sealer would be applied. Seam sealer is essential for waterproofing and protecting the joints. Now before spraying the vehicle, we masked off the engine to prevent overspray. Once that was done, we mixed the paint and sprayed down the spot welds and seam sealer to blend everything in. Next, I reinstalled the fuse box and threaded the engine wiring loom through the dash, plugging it into the ECU. After that, we refitted the radiator, airbox, battery tray cover, battery, and intercooler. Once everything was in place, we topped up the power steering fluid and filled the radiator with coolant. Now it was ready for its first start. And just like that, first try, it fired right up. Now it's time to bleed the power steering system. To get the Hilux moving, we needed to fill it up with transmission fluid. Once topped up, we had to run the fluid through the gears to ensure proper lubrication and smooth shifting. This helps circulate the fluid and prevent any dry spots within the transmission. Yep. And now it was time to move it. With all the mechanical work done, it was time to prepare everything for paint. Need to paint the bin. Wheel arch is coming out. Now it is time to paint the underneath of the bin.
This is all the dents are pushed and all of it. What you're seeing here?
Yeah, what's that primer?
This is primer. Yeah, I had one dent here, had one dent here from a previous mistake, which they fixed. So, and
And there you have it. After all of the hard work, here it is. The fully rebuilt Toyota Hilux Legend 50 4x4 automatic 2.8 GD6 is ready to be back on the road.